The emergency alarm on Orbital Station Aethel-9 had been screaming for 6 excruciating seconds before my brain finally registered what was happening. My body had locked completely. Every muscle, every delicate joint, every crystalline ridge along my forearms went rigid in the ancient, involuntary paralysis my species never managed to evolve past. I could not move. I could not speak. I could only watch through frozen eyes as the massive Dratha warlord cadet, Kaelen, lifted a tiny, helpless Polari student off the deck plates by her throat. The small creature kicked uselessly against the air, her breathing turning into a high-pitched, wet whistle. Professor Vane, a fragile Varsky scholar, stumbled backward into the glowing hologram display with his hands raised in surrender. But surrender meant nothing to Kaelen. In his mind, he was an apex predator, and the classroom belonged to him. If I am going to tell you the truth about what happened that day at the Concord Military and Diplomatic Academy, I need to tell you about her first. I need to tell you about the human. My name is Relic Sav. I am Veilani. My species is tall, slender, and built with hollow bones laced with mineral deposits that give our skin a faint, opalescent shimmer. It is aesthetically beautiful, but structurally, we are about as durable as spun glass. I enrolled at the academy aiming for a quiet career in interplanetary logistics. I sat in the middle row, took meticulous notes, and tried very hard never to catch the eye of anything with claws. The academy housed students from 56 sovereign species. There were the Dratha, 3-meter-tall armored behemoths built like a cross between a crocodile and a tank. There were the Keth, precise, insectoid warriors who communicated in terrifying subsonic clicks. And then, at the start of my second year, the Board of Regents admitted the first human exchange student in Galactic history. Her name was Maya Vance. She arrived carrying a single duffel bag and a primitive-bound notebook made of recycled paper, which several alien cadets mistook for a biohazard artifact. Maya was shorter than almost every species on campus. She had dark braided hair, sun-bronzed skin, and an easy, open smile that I initially found baffling. Earth had only recently been granted probationary status in the interstellar Concord. The general consensus among the student body was that admitting her was a hollow political gesture. Humans were classified as a pre-integration species from a Category-12 Deathworld called Earth. Deathworld sounded terrifying on paper, but looking at Maya, it seemed like a bad joke. She had no natural armor, no venom, no retractable talons, no bioluminescent threat displays. Nothing. She sat in the very back row of every lecture hall. She doodled in her paper notebook with a wooden graphite pencil. She asked endless questions in the mess hall about which alien meals were safe for her, genuinely amused when told that certain spices could dissolve her throat. By every metric I could identify, Maya Vance was the least impressive biological specimen on the station. I was assigned as her study partner for Professor Vane's seminar on cross-species escalation tactics. During our first meeting, she mispronounced my species name 3 times, blushing profusely and apologizing so sincerely that I had to tell her it was fine just to make her stop. She seemed painfully concerned with social harmony. The other students viewed her as a joke. The Dratha ignored her entirely, treating her like furniture. The upperclassmen openly joked in the commons that admitting a human was like bringing a tiny house pet to a war council, cute, but entirely useless in a real conflict. Maya was sitting just 2 tables away when they said it. She heard every word. She didn't flinch. She simply took another bite of her Earth ration meal, turned a page in her book, and kept reading. I thought she was either terribly naive or painfully weak. I was wrong about both. The atmosphere at the academy was governed by an unspoken law: know your place in the food chain. For 2 years, Kaelen Varn, the son of a high-ranking Dratha fleet admiral, had ruled the corridors through pure, unchecked terror. He stood nearly 9 feet tall, covered in interlocking, bone-dense dermal plates capable of deflecting low-caliber plasma fire. His jaws contained 3 rows of jagged, pressure-bearing teeth, and his chest housed dual hearts that pumped adrenaline-heavy blood through a body built exclusively for war. Kaelen didn't come to the academy to learn diplomacy. He came to collect a prestige credential before taking command of a warship. He brought 2 brutal lieutenants with him, Bruck and Tesh, and together they moved through the station like a rolling storm. They referred to lighter species as prey animals. They made casual comments about crushing glass bones, snapping fragile carapaces, and forcing aquatic students out of their environmental tanks just to watch them suffocate. Nobody stopped them. The station administration was terrified of provoking a diplomatic crisis with the Dratha Imperium. So, complaints were buried, reports were marked as cultural misunderstandings, and the rest of us learned to survive by making ourselves invisible. Maya Vance, however, never learned how to look afraid. On her 4th day, Maya walked into the crowded student commons, carrying a small foil wrapper. Without realizing it, she sat down at the large, central table strictly claimed by Kaelen's squad. I watched from 40 feet away, my heart hammering against my ribs. Kaelen approached her, looming over her like a mountain of armored muscle, his throat crest flaring in a silent display of lethal dominance. The entire mess hall went dead silent. Maya looked up. She didn't cower. She didn't drop her gaze. Instead, she offered him a small, dark square from her foil wrapper. "It's called dark chocolate," she said warmly, her voice carrying across the quiet room. "It's a delicacy from Earth. Back home, sharing food is how we start a friendship." Kaelen stared at the tiny human. Slowly, he reached down with a heavy, clawed hand, took the chocolate, and crushed it into fine, dark dust between his armored fingers. He let the powder fall over her paper notebook, spat on the deck beside her chair, and walked away without a word. Maya looked down at the ruined chocolate. She looked at Kaelen's retreating back. Then, she did something that made my stomach turn inside out. She shrugged. She brushed the powder off her notebook, took a sip of her water, and went back to writing. I stared at her, utterly convinced she was insane. She didn't understand the sheer scale of the monsters surrounding her. That night, I saw her standing alone at the observation viewport, staring out into the pitch-black void of space. She looked so tiny against the backdrop of distant stars, a fragile creature millions of light-years away from home. Surrounded by apex predators who viewed her as nothing more than a minor inconvenience. I almost walked over to warn her. I almost told her to pack her bags and take the first transport back to Earth before Kaelen decided to snap her in half. Instead, I turned around and walked back to my quarters. I told myself she wasn't my responsibility. I told myself that humans were simply out of their depth in a galaxy built by giants. As the weeks turned into months, a strange, quiet dynamic developed between Maya and me. We became study partners by necessity. Maya struggled with advanced quantum navigation, while I struggled to understand human history. It was during these late-night study sessions in the quiet corners of the station library that I began to notice small, terrifying anomalies about her biology. First was her sleep cycle. Veilani require 9 hours of deep, uninterrupted metabolic rest, or our neural pathways degrade. Maya could operate on 4 hours of restless sleep for 3 consecutive days and still retain high-level analytical focus. When I asked her how that was possible, she chuckled and said, "It's called finals week in college. You get used to it." Second was her capacity for cellular regeneration. During a zero-gravity physics lab, a jagged piece of metal sliced open her forearm. A cut that deep on a Veilani would have required months of bone grafting and left permanent structural weakness. Maya simply wrapped a piece of cloth around it, applied a sting of antiseptic, and kept working. Within 8 days, the wound had closed into a faint, fading pink line. Her body was constantly repairing itself at a terrifying speed. Third was her diet. Maya consumed chemical compounds that were classified as mild neurotoxins by 6 different galactic governments. She routinely poured a bright red liquid over her food, something called capsaicin, which was literally an evolutionary chemical weapon developed by Earth plants to stop mammals from eating them. When I warned her that it was an irritant, she grinned and asked if I wanted to try some. I declined with genuine horror. One evening, while cross-referencing military doctrine, I asked her about Earth's planetary conditions. She opened her datapad and pulled up video archives of human athletic competitions. I watched in absolute disbelief as two teams of unarmored humans ran full speed into each other, slamming their bodies together with bone-shattering force, driving one another into frozen mud. Only to spit blood, stand right back up, and grin at their opponents. What class of combat training is this? I asked, my voice trembling. That's rugby, she said casually, tapping her pencil against her cheek. It's a game we play on weekends. I couldn't sleep that night. While Maya appeared peaceful, I began noticing that her eyes were never truly idle. She watched everything. She catalogued the movement patterns of the students, the reaction times of the station guards, and the subtle physiological shifts of the predator species when they were angry. Late at night in the library, while I was reviewing trade agreements, I caught a glimpse of her screen. She wasn't reviewing diplomatic protocol. She was reading high-tier xenobiology databases. Her screen displayed detailed, three-dimensional muscular and skeletal schematics of a Dratha male. She was highlighting specific joint overlaps, nerve clusters, and gaps in dermal armor plating, memorizing structural vulnerabilities with cold, systematic precision. When she saw me looking, she calmly closed the window and opened her class notes. Neither of us said a word. Meanwhile, Kaelen's reign of terror reached a breaking point. A week later, he cornered a chiffon student in the engineering wing, emitting a low-frequency sonic growl that triggered an involuntary defensive seizure in the boy's exoskeleton. The student was trapped in a paralyzed curl for 4 hours before medics could release him. Days after that, Kaelen accidentally slammed against the hover tank of an aquatic Maluri student, cracking the pressure seal. Toxic alkaline fluid spilled across the floor, leaving the student gasping for air as their gill membranes dried. Medics saved his life, but he transferred off the station the next morning. The administration issued warnings, but the Dratha embassy intervened every time, claiming cultural insensitivity against traditional Dratha dominance rituals. I was furious. I was also terrified, a combination that fills a Vailani with deep self-loathing. Our fear response is hardwired. When faced with an apex threat, our bodies freeze. It is an evolutionary death sentence disguised as a defense mechanism. I couldn't fight Kaelen even if I wanted to, my own nervous system wouldn't allow it. After the Maluri incident, Maya set her pencil down, looked at me, and asked a single, quiet question. Has anyone on this station ever actually hit him back? It is biologically impossible, I whispered, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. He is an apex predator from a high-gravity homeworld. His bones are reinforced with calcium-titanium matrices. His threat display triggers involuntary neurological paralysis in prey species. You cannot fight biology, Maya. Maya looked at her hands, flexing her bruised knuckles slightly. Biology, she murmured, is just an engineering problem waiting for a solution. 3 days later, Kaelen came for me. It happened in the secondary maintenance corridor outside the science wing during the afternoon lull. The hall was completely empty. I was walking back to my quarters, holding my research datapad, when a massive shadow fell over me. I looked up. Kaelen stood directly in front of me. Behind me, blocking the only escape route, were his 2 lieutenants, Bruck and Tesh. I was trapped. Little glass bug, Kaelen rumbled, his voice vibrating through the deck plates beneath my feet. I've seen you whispering with the human Deathworlder. Do you think having a small mammal around makes you safe? We are just studying for exams, Cadet Kaelen, I stammered, my heart slamming against my ribs like a trapped bird. You don't belong in this academy, he sneered, stepping closer. None of you fragile, soft-skinned weaklings do. Without warning, Kaelen struck out with his heavy, armored forearm, shoving me violently against the metallic bulkhead. Crack. Pain exploded through my left arm as one of my crystalline forearm ridges fractured under the blunt impact. The sound echoed off the bare walls like shattering ice. Instantly, my biological hardwiring kicked in. My central nervous system flooded my body with paralyzing hormones. My joints locked tight. My jaw clamped shut. I collapsed against the wall, utterly rigid, unable to move a single muscle, unable to scream, unable to even blink. Kaelen leaned down, his massive, scaled face inches from mine, his 3 rows of razor-sharp teeth glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Tell the human that if she keeps looking at me in the commons, I'll snap both of your arms next time," he whispered. He turned and casually walked away with his lieutenants, laughing as their heavy footsteps faded down the hall. I remained frozen against that wall for 11 agonizing minutes. 11 minutes of standing in terrifying silence, feeling the white-hot agony of my broken ridge radiating up my shoulder, completely helpless inside my own body. I felt a level of self-loathing so profound it felt like poison. I hated my hollow bones. I hated my species. I hated a galaxy that allowed monsters to walk freely while the rest of us were forced to freeze and bleed. When the paralysis finally receded, I collapsed onto the cold deck plates, sobbing silently, holding my shattered forearm. Maya found me 20 minutes later. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't offer empty pity. She saw my shattered ridge, saw my trembling frame, and her entire face changed. It wasn't a sudden explosion of rage. It was a subtle, terrifying shift. Her jaw tightened, her posture went perfectly still, and her brown eyes narrowed into something dark, cold, and utterly bottomless. It reminded me of the heavy steel blast doors that seal a ship right before a hull breach. She helped me to my feet without a word, walked me down to the medical bay, and stood silently beside my bio-bed while the automated surgical unit fused my crystalline bone. She didn't speak for 2 straight hours. That night, I learned that Maya walked directly to the dean's office and filed an official incident report detailing Kaelen's assault on me, complete with timestamps and medical records. The report was rejected in less than 45 minutes. Insufficient evidence of intent. Incident deemed an accidental collision in a high-density hallway. A classmate told me later that Maya sat alone in the mess hall after receiving the rejection notice. She sat at her small corner table, staring at the glowing rejection letter on her datapad. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She just sat there, perfectly motionless, for a long, long time. Humans have a phrase for that kind of quiet. They call it the calm before the storm. It's the moment right before the atmosphere rips open, when the sky turns dark and the pressure drops so low that every wild animal on Earth knows it's time to hide underground. None of us on Station Aethel-9 had that instinct. We had no idea what was coming. It happened on a Tuesday morning in Professor Vane's seminar room. The class was cross-species escalation tactics. The cruel irony of that title still resonates with me today. The seminar room was a steep, tiered amphitheater with curved desks arranged in ascending rows leading up to a high observation deck. There were 2 heavy titanium blast doors, one at the bottom near the professor's lectern, and one at the very top row. Kaelen and his 2 lieutenants always sat in the front row, right near the lectern, a tactical placement designed to establish spatial dominance over the room. The rest of us scattered across the middle and upper rows, keeping as much physical distance between ourselves and the Dratha as possible. Maya was in her usual spot in the very back row, her paper notebook open, her pencil held lightly between her fingers. She looked completely normal. There was a tiny white adhesive bandage on her left hand from a minor lab burn. And I remember looking at her and thinking how tragically delicate she seemed compared to the behemoths sitting 30 feet below her. Professor Vane began his lecture, his thin, reedy voice echoing off the curved walls. He was discussing the historical failure of diplomatic treaties when predator species were allowed to dictate terms. Then, Professor Vane made a fatal mistake. He attempted to use a real-world example. Consider the recent interpersonal friction within our own academic halls, Vane said carefully, trying to wrap his words in layers of neutral academic abstraction. When a dominant biological entity enforces social compliance through implicit physical threat, the structural integrity of the group dissolves. Kaelen stood up. The movement was so violent that his heavy steel desk slammed sideways, shrieking against the floorboards. The sound alone sent a wave of terror through the room. I felt my forearms lock immediately. Next to me, two insectoid students curled into defensive balls, their carapaces clicking shut. Kaelen flared his throat crest to its maximum capacity, a fan of jagged bone and scarlet membrane that effectively doubled his size. He unlocked his inner jaw, exposing 3 rows of glistening teeth, and released a full-spectrum Dratha threat display. Simultaneously, Kaelen's body began pumping high-density terror pheromones into the room's ventilation system. It was a biological chemical attack. The pheromones hit my olfactory receptors like an electric shock. My central nervous system went dead. Total, complete biological lock. My vision narrowed to a pinprick. I couldn't move my legs. I couldn't blink. I was a prisoner in a frozen shell. Professor Vane stumbled backward, his hands raised in absolute terror, slamming into his own display board, paralyzed with fear. At the top and bottom of the room, Kaelen's lieutenants, Bruck and Tesh, stepped to the blast doors and slammed the manual overrides. The heavy titanium doors hissed shut with a terrifying metallic thud, locking all 32 students inside. I am done listening to weaklings. Kaelen roared, his voice rattling the light fixtures. I am done pretending that glass bugs, soft-skinned freaks, and water breathers deserve to breathe the same air as the Dratha Imperium. This academy is a farm, and you are all livestock. Kaelen reached out, grabbed the nearest student, a tiny, terrified Pelori girl named Desi, and lifted her off the deck plates by her throat with one massive hand. Desi kicked her short legs helplessly, making that awful, choking whistle sound. Her oxygen was cutting off. Her eyes rolled back into her head. Look at her. Kaelen snarled, shaking the helpless girl like a ragdoll. This is what happens when you pretend prey can sit at the same table as predators. Professor Vane frantically slapped the station emergency button on the wall. Red warning lights began strobing across the ceiling, casting blood-red flashes over the horrified, frozen faces of the students. But security was 3 decks below. The fastest response time was 4 minutes. Desi had less than 30 seconds before her neck snapped. I wanted to move. God help me, I wanted to stand up, to throw a chair, to scream, to do anything. But my Valani biology held me in a vice grip. I was a statue. We were all statues, waiting to watch a child die. And then, in the very back row of the amphitheater, Maya Vance stood up. She didn't rush. She didn't scream. She slowly closed her paper notebook. She placed her wooden pencil neatly beside it. She pushed her chair back, stepped around her desk, and began walking down the concrete steps toward the front of the room. She walked straight through the invisible cloud of Dratha terror pheromones that had paralyzed 30 alien students. She didn't stumble. She didn't flinch. Her heart rate didn't even spike. What Kaelen and the Dratha didn't know, what none of us knew, was that human nervous systems lacked the specific chemoreceptor pathways that Dratha pheromones target. The chemical weapon that had turned an entire room of galactic citizens into frozen stone simply had no effect on a Deathworlder from Earth. To Maya, it was just stinky air. She stopped 10 feet from Kaelen. Desi was dangling from his grip, her kicks growing feebler by the second. Maya looked up at the 9-foot armored giant. Her voice was remarkably calm, almost conversational. Put her down, Maya said. Kaelen turned his massive head, staring down at Maya in utter disbelief. To a Dratha, Maya looked absurd. She was half his height, possessed no armor, had no claws, and weighed less than one of his legs. She was standing in front of an apex predator, giving orders as if she had the right to speak. Kaelen burst into a loud, booming laugh that vibrated through the deck. With a careless flick of his wrist, he tossed Desi aside. The tiny Pelori girl skittered across the floor, crashing against a desk, gasping for air. Kaelen dropped into a low, predatory combat stance, his massive claws flexing, his jaw dripping with saliva. "You want to die first, little human?" Kaelen sneered. Maya didn't answer. She took a deep breath, adjusted her stance, and shifted her weight backward. What happened next lasted exactly 63 seconds. I know this because the security feed was later analyzed frame by military generals across 3 star systems. Kaelen lunged forward with terrifying speed, his heavy claw sweeping in a lethal arc aimed straight for Maya's neck. A strike from that hand had enough force to decapitate a Veilani. Maya didn't try to block it. She ducked beneath the strike, diving inside his reach, driving her left shoulder with brutal momentum straight into his chest. She leveraged his own forward velocity against him. The impact sounded like a cannon shot. Kaelen, a 9-foot, 800-pound monster, was staggered backward by a full 2 paces. The room held its breath. Kaelen roared in fury, spinning around to strike again. But Maya was already moving. She ducked under his second wild swing, grabbed his overextended arm, drove her foot against the back of his knee, and channeled his weight directly into a heavy steel lectern. The lectern shattered into twisted metal. "Bruck! Tesh! Kill her!" Kaelen bellowed, his voice laced with the first hint of panic. Bruck, the larger of the 2 lieutenants, abandoned his post at the upper blast door and charged down the concrete steps like an avalanche. He caught Maya from behind with a running tackle, slamming her body violently against the concrete steps. Thud. Maya hit the stone floor hard and rolled. When she pushed herself back up, a deep gash had opened above her left eyebrow. Bright, thick, scarlet blood was streaming down her face, dripping off her chin onto her uniform. It was red. Impossibly, terrifyingly red. For a second, I thought it was over. I thought she was broken. Then I saw her eyes. The moment her own blood touched her lips, something ancient and primal awoke inside Maya Vance. Human Deathworlders possess an internal evolutionary chemical system called adrenaline. When injured, their hearts pump high doses of steroids and oxygen-rich blood into their muscles, shutting down pain receptors, elevating reaction speeds, and unlocking physical strength that defies standard biological parameters. Maya didn't retreat. She charged. She dodged Bruck's secondary strike, seized his extended wrist, and drove her palm straight upward into his elbow joint, hinging the armored limb backward against its natural rotation. Snap! Bruck let out a sickening, high-pitched scream as his joint fractured. Maya didn't stop. She spun on her heel, drove a brutal spinning side kick into Tesh's throat, hitting the exact soft membrane gap beneath his jaw plating, the exact vulnerability she had been studying in the library. Tesh collapsed to the floor, clutching his throat, gasping for air. Kaelen was back on his feet, his eyes wild with rage, swinging wildly. Maya ducked beneath a horizontal claw swipe, stepped inside his guard, and delivered a devastating 3-strike combination, a palm strike to his lower sternum, a bone-shattering knee to his hip joint, and a driving elbow directly into the cluster of raw nerves hidden beneath his flared throat crest. She hit a nerve center that wasn't listed in any standard textbook, a point she had deduced through weeks of quiet, late-night research. Kaelen's dual hearts misfired under the neurological shock. His eyes rolled into the back of his head. His legs buckled. The massive, 9-foot Dratha warlord crashed face-first onto the concrete floor, shattering the deck plates beneath him, lying completely unconscious in a pool of his own crushed pride. Silence fell over the room. The emergency sirens were still strobing red. The chemical fog of Dratha pheromones was beginning to clear. My paralysis finally released its grip, my trembling body collapsing back into my seat as I gasped for air. In the center of the shattered classroom, surrounded by broken furniture and 3 fallen Dratha warriors, stood Maya Vance. Her uniform was torn. Blood was dripping down her face, staining her collar. Her hands were raw, bruised, and split across the knuckles. She was shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the brutal chemical aftermath of an adrenaline cascade metabolizing through her blood. She didn't brag. She didn't roar. She didn't strike a victory pose. She slowly walked over to where tiny Desi lay shivering on the floor. Maya knelt down, her bloody, raw hands moving with delicate, gentle care as she checked the Pelori girl's pulse. Satisfied that Desi was breathing, Maya sat down on the cold floor beside the child, pulled her close, and held her hand. When security forces finally blew open the blast doors 4 minutes later, weapons raised, expecting a massacre, they found a small human girl sitting in the rubble, holding a crying child. Wiping blood from her eyes. Maya looked up at the lead security officer, her voice quiet and steady. 3 cadets assaulted a student, Maya said calmly. I intervened. I'd like to file a report now, please. The 3 days following the classroom incident shook Station Aethel-9 to its core. Kaelen and his lieutenants were confined to the intensive care unit. Kaelen suffered a shattered hip joint, a fractured neural cluster, and severe internal hemorrhaging. The chief medical officer, a veteran military surgeon, stated publicly that the strikes delivered to Kaelen were executed with a level of anatomical precision usually reserved for high-level surgical procedures or elite special operations operatives. The Dratha Imperium's embassy was incandescent with rage. High Ambassador Vance, a terrifying, ancient Dratha warlord, arrived on the station via armored dreadnought. He demanded Maya's immediate execution, or at minimum, her permanent expulsion and extradition to a Dratha penal colony. He filed formal declarations claiming Earth had sent an illegally modified combat assassin under the guise of an exchange student. An emergency tribunal was convened in the station's massive high assembly chamber. The gallery was packed with thousands of students and faculty members from over 50 star systems. Desi sat in the front row of the gallery, her neck wrapped in medical bandages, her dark eyes fixed on the floor. I stood among the 19 student witnesses called to testify. Maya sat alone at the respondents' table in the center of the vast floor. She wore a pristine white student uniform. The gash above her eye had been sealed with a thin, clear medical strip. Her bruised knuckles were neatly bandaged. Because Earth was a probationary member, she was denied formal Concord legal representation. She stood alone, representing herself against a panel of 7 alien judges and a furious Dratha ambassador. Ambassador Vance took the floor first, his roaring voice filling the chamber as he projected holographic images of Kaelen's injuries. This human is a monster. Vance bellowed, pointing a clawed finger at Maya. She bypassed our elite cadets' defenses. She demonstrated lethal combat techniques designed to disable Dratha officers. She is a threat to civilized society, and humanity must be stripped of its probationary status immediately. The panel of judges looked stern. The political pressure to appease the Dratha Imperium was overwhelming. Then, Maya stood up. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't yell. She walked to the podium, opened her datapad, and began speaking with the cold, methodical precision of a prosecutor. 3 weeks ago, Maya began, her voice echoing clearly through the quiet hall. I filed an official report detailing systematic physical abuse committed by Cadet Kaelen against 6 different students. That report was rejected due to insufficient evidence. She tapped her datapad. A massive holographic screen lit up above the chamber floor. So, I gathered evidence, she said coldly. For the next 20 minutes, Maya presented a terrifyingly comprehensive archive. She displayed timestamps, medical records, and security logs documenting 12 separate unprovoked attacks carried out by Kaelen's squad over 4 months. She showed the chiffon student paralyzed in the engineering wing. She showed the cracked hover tank of the Meluri student. She showed the medical scans of my shattered crystalline arm. Then, she played the full, unedited security footage from Professor Vane's classroom. The gallery watched in absolute silence as the hologram displayed Kaelen closing the blast doors, deploying his terror pheromones, trapping 30 helpless students, and slowly strangling a child to death while the rest of the room sat frozen in biological paralysis. Then, the footage showed Maya standing up, closing her paper notebook, and walking down the steps. When the video finished, the chamber was so quiet you could hear the hum of the atmospheric scrubbers. Maya looked directly at the panel of judges. Under Article 4, Section 7 of the Concord Academy Charter, Maya cited impeccably. Every enrolled cadet possesses the legal obligation to render aid to a fellow student facing imminent lethal harm when station security is unavailable. Under Article 8, Section 3, proportional force is explicitly authorized in the defense of another. Ambassador Goran Vance slammed his fist onto his table. You broke his neural cluster. That knowledge is restricted to military medical databases. How did a pre-integration human obtain that information? Maya turned her gaze slowly toward the ambassador. I didn't steal military files, Maya said calmly. I spent my evenings in your open-access station library. I am a biology major at the University of São Paulo. I studied comparative xenobiology because I believed that if I was going to live among you, I had a responsibility to understand your bodies, how to help you if you were sick, and how to stop you if you tried to kill a child. She paused, taking a deep breath, her eyes sweeping over the thousands of alien faces staring down at her. Where I come from, Maya said, her voice dropping into a deep, echoing resonance, there is a simple rule: if you have the ability to act, you have the responsibility to act. I tried your complaints. I tried your protocols. I tried your formal channels. The system failed. So, I used my hands. She stepped back from the podium. I am not sorry for protecting Desi, she said firmly. And if you put another child in front of a monster in my presence, I will do it again. The tribunal deliberated for 2 agonizing hours. The Dratha delegation made implicit threats of trade blockades, but the evidence was too absolute. The video footage had already leaked to the Galactic datanet. Public outrage was exploding across 20 star systems. The tribunal issued its verdict: Cadet Kaelen and his lieutenants were permanently expelled from the academy and stripped of their military tracks. Maya Vance was issued a formal administrative reprimand for excessive application of force, a political compromise meant to save the Dratha's face, but one that carried 0 actual penalty. Maya Vance remained enrolled. 6 weeks after the incident, I sat in the main student commons during the lunch rush, trying to pinpoint the exact moment the universe changed. It hadn't happened with a sudden explosion. It had happened like the rising sun, slowly, steadily, until you suddenly realize you are no longer sitting in the dark. The commons looked visually similar, but the social atmosphere was unrecognizable. For 2 years, the mess hall had been strictly divided by biological caste. The apex predators sat in the center, while prey species hovered near the walls, huddled in fearful, isolated groups. Now, that map was completely gone. At a center table, a chiffon insectoid student was laughing loudly with 3 Vailani scholars, working on an advanced astrophysics model. Nearby, an aquatic Maluri student glided in his hover tank, carrying 2 Pelori cadets on his frame as they debated musical composition across species lines. Students were talking, laughing, and sitting together, not because they were forced to, but because the invisible barrier of fear had been shattered into dust. Maya Vance was sitting in her usual corner table. She wasn't holding court. She wasn't making speeches. She was eating her lunch, writing in her paper notebook with her graphite pencil, and asking a Maluri classmate if capsaicin sauce would melt his hover tank glass. The story of the human exchange student who walked through a chemical terror attack to beat 3 Dratha warriors had spread across the entire Concord. Humanity was no longer viewed as a fragile, primitive curiosity. They were recognized as something entirely new to the galaxy, a species that possessed terrifying physical capacity, but chose to weaponize it in defense of the weak. I walked over to her table and sat down. "You changed everything," I said quietly, setting my datapad down. Maya looked up from her notebook, offering a small, dry smile. "I just wanted to finish my seminar, Relic." "No," I insisted, shaking my head. "You don't understand. For thousands of years, my species believed that fear was an absolute law. We believed that being fragile meant being helpless. You showed us that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's deciding that something else is more important than being afraid." Maya was quiet for a moment. She looked out the large viewport glass at the distant nebula swirling in the void. "Humans are afraid all the time, Relic," she said softly. "We come from a world that tried to kill us for 1,000,000 years. We aren't strong because we don't feel fear. We're strong because when we get terrified, we stand up anyway." She reached into her bag, pulled out a loose sheet of paper from her notebook, and slid it across the table to me. It was a graphite drawing. Maya had drawn it herself during study hours. It depicted the student commons, not as a place of fear and divided territories, but as a vibrant, unified hall where dozens of different species sat together, sharing food, laughing, and learning without fear. "I drew this my first week here," she murmured. "This is what I thought the galaxy was supposed to look like." I held the drawing in my hands, my fingers trembling slightly. That afternoon, I received my official placement notice. I had been accepted into the Interstellar Diplomatic Corps. I hadn't earned it through networking or timid compliance. I earned it because, during my interview, I stopped acting like a victim and spoke with the quiet, grounded authority I had learned from watching a human girl stand up in a shattered classroom. 10 years have passed since that day. Today, I serve as a chief diplomatic envoy for the Concord Assembly on Station Aethel-9. Hanging on the wall behind my desk, housed in a sealed, protective glass frame, is Maya's graphite sketch of the mess hall. Visitors often ask me about it. They see the simple pencil lines on fragile earth paper and ask why a high diplomat keeps a student sketch in his office. I tell them it was drawn by a human. I tell them it shows the future, rendered by a girl who saw what the galaxy could be before the rest of us even realized we were allowed to dream it. And then, if they have time, I tell them the story of the human exchange student who closed her notebook, put down her pencil, and stood up. They always stay to listen. Everyone does. Because that is the ultimate truth about humanity that the galaxy learned too late. Humans don't conquer star systems with massive war fleets or economic tyranny. They conquer you with a square of chocolate offered to a stranger, a drawing torn from a notebook, and a quiet, unyielding voice saying, "Put her down."